Thank you very much. That concludes general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Jackson Carlow.
Presiding Officer, this last weekend we learned about the tragic death of another child, a 3-year-old boy at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital campus in Glasgow. And this is in addition to the death of 10-year-old Millie Main. Now, on Monday, the Health Secretary was asked directly on BBC Radio Scotland whether she knew about the boy's death and the subsequent investigation. The Health Secretary replied claiming she did not know, yet yesterday in Parliament subsequently said that she did. How does the First Minister reconcile this?
First Minister.
Well, before I answer that question, can I take this opportunity in the Chamber to do, as I have done in the last few days in media interviews, and that is to express my deepest condolences to the families of the children that Jackson Carlow has referred to today. It is impossible for any of us to imagine what a parent goes through when they lose a child in any circumstances. But that pain, of course, is compounded when they lose a child in the circumstances such as we are talking about. I also want to take the opportunity to reiterate the Health Secretary's apology yesterday, particularly in light of the feelings of families that they have not had answers to the questions that they want answers to from the Health Board, and that they have not been given the information that they have been seeking. The Scottish Government is determined that they get answers to their questions, and there is a range of work in place to ensure that that is the case. Ongoing work involving Health Protection Scotland, an independent review that is currently underway, and of course the public inquiry that was announced by the Health Secretary, the chair of which we hope will be announced before Christmas. On this specific question that Jackson Carlow has asked me, and the Health Secretary covered this point in the Chamber yesterday. On the radio, the Health Secretary, when she answered no, was referring to the investigation. It was a two-part question, where the latter part was about the investigation. There was no notification to the Scottish Government from the board or indeed of the referral to the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit, but the Cabinet Secretary had previously been in correspondence with the family and the representative about this loss. Let me be absolutely clear that the Scottish Government is determined that we get, on behalf of families concerned, to the bottom of all of the questions that they have, and we will leave no stone unturned in our efforts to do so.
Jackson Carlow.
Can I endorse the opening comments there by the First Minister? But on the substance of the question, I think many will find it extraordinary that the First Minister is endeavouring to back up the current version of events. Now, let me refer to the exchange from Monday's Good Morning Scotland. The presenter specifically asked this: did you also know about the death of this 3-year-old and the subsequent investigation? The Health Secretary replied, no, I didn't. There was nothing else. No, I didn't. Presiding Officer, wouldn't every person listening understand from that exchange that the Health Secretary was saying she did not know about this child's death? Is the First Minister seriously trying to tell us that's not the case, nor a reasonable conclusion? First Minister.
Can I say, in all sincerity, to Jackson Carlow, I'm sure all of us have been in interview situations before where we answer a question. If we go back and look at the text of that, we thought we were answering a particular question and answering it honestly. But can I also say to Jackson Carlow, because I don't want to minimise in any way the seriousness of these issues, but I would also put to Jackson Carlow, the Health Secretary had corresponded with the family of the child, and I would simply ask him to reflect on why then she would have sought to say that she didn't know about it when there was correspondence in existence that showed that she had. The important matters here are that the Cabinet Secretary all along has acted to make sure that the right actions are being taken. Those are actions to make sure that the services that we are talking about here in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital are safe, that the remedial action is taken to the wards in question, and that there is full and transparent investigation of all of the issues concerned. Health Protection Scotland has been involved for some time and has ongoing involvement. There is an independent review underway which we expect to report in the spring of next year, and there will be a full public inquiry. And that is because we are determined that all answers to these questions are addressed, and that families feel that they have the answers and the information that they require. And as First Minister, I am serious in our determination to achieve that. There is also, of course, questions that were raised yesterday about the level of escalation of oversight of the board, and the Health Secretary set out the process that is underway to address that. I think there is a strong case for such escalation, and the Scottish Government's Health and Care Board will meet tomorrow to consider that very matter, and I would expect those processes to be completed as speedily as possible.
Jackson Carlo.
Have, as politicians, we been in a position where we think we've been asked a different question? Yes. But the specific question was, did you also know about the death of this 3-year-old and the subsequent investigation? I don't understand where the ambiguity lies in that question. So we now know that in this case, the Health Secretary did receive correspondence from the family and from local MSPs in November last year advising her of this child's death. And last week, when pressed on her handling of the scandal, the Health Secretary asked us to judge her on her actions. In which case, what actions did she take after learning last year of the tragic death of that 3-year-old boy? What has been done in the 12 months since she was first told about it? And here's one very specific action that could have been taken. As soon as the Health Secretary learned about it, shouldn't she have demanded a report be delivered to her desk by the end of that week? Isn't that the very least that should have been done?
First Minister.
The Health Secretary took, in my view, appropriate action. When any correspondence of such a nature is received, proper investigation and discussion with a health board will take place. There has, as we have discussed in this chamber before, as the Health Secretary has set out in some detail, been a range of remedial actions taken to address the underlying issues in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital when we arrived at a point where there was not confidence that those remedial actions had been sufficiently effective. The wards in question were closed and remain closed today. Health Protection Scotland has been actively involved with the Health Board. So actions have been taken to ensure that these issues are addressed. There are a number of questions that people particularly and very understandably that parents have about this, which is why we have also set in train the independent review and, of course, the public inquiry, which I hope will be up and running as quickly as possible. We are determined that there will be full transparency, full discussion and interrogation of all of these issues, because the parents concerned deserve nothing less. And actually, I think the public more generally who rely on our National Health Service, particularly when we're talking about the care and treatment of children, deserve nothing less as well. And as I said earlier on, the Scottish Government, including the Health Secretary, particularly the Health Secretary, is determined to leave no stone unturned to get to those answers.
Jackson Carlo.
You know, at the heart of this is the death of young children, but, presiding officer, this is increasingly about trust. As more details of this scandal grudgingly emerge, this SNP government is leaking trust by the minute. On the one hand, ministers go on the radio to say they don't know about deaths that have taken place, and it's only when MSPs bring evidence to this chamber that they suddenly admit that actually they did know and give, frankly, ludicrous explanations for this change in position. Last night, Charmaine Lecoq, the mother of a child who has received treatment for cancer at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, said this: "We have no trust in the Health Board. We have no trust in any of the information coming out of the hospital, and we have very little trust that she, the Health Secretary, is actually listening to us." Given the Health Secretary's story keeps changing over what she did and did not know, isn't Miss Lecoq right to say so?
First Minister.
That last characterisation of the Health Secretary's position is not the case. The Health Secretary is determined that parents concerned get the answers that they deserve and that they so understandably have asked for. After the Health Secretary met with parents, she appointed Professor Craig White to be a direct point of contact, because there was very clearly a lack of trust in the information that was coming from the Health Board. Professor Craig White has been tasked with making sure that every question that is coming forward from parents is properly addressed, and we will continue with that process. I think following that initial meeting, there were a large number of questions that were recorded and worked through in terms of getting the answers to parents. There will, of course, be some issues here that may not be able to be addressed until we have the independent review report and also the investigation that will come from the public inquiry. But we are determined that every point that has been raised here will be answered. They will be answered for the parents concerned, and they will be answered for the sake of the wider public, who have a right to expect that the services that any hospital provides are safe and of a high quality.
Thank you. Question 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, yesterday the Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing told Parliament, and let me quote him, "This government is absolutely committed to a publicly owned, operated and commissioned NHS in Scotland." Does the First Minister agree with her Minister?
First Minister.
Yes.
Richard Leonard.
Well, the uncomfortable truth is that private firms are being brought in by this government to carry out routine operations at the heart of our public health service. Last night I spoke to an NHS clinician. He had contacted us to raise his concerns about a plan to contract out to a private healthcare provider knee and hip operations at Naval Hospital in Glasgow. He told me that the hospital's own clinicians have been cut out of the planning of this, that the Health Board has presented it as a fait accompli, and that it was directed from Edinburgh. There is anger among NHS clinicians and local NHS staff who work at Naval. They are concerned that they have not been involved in the setting of clinical priorities or in carrying out these procedures, and if there are complications, they will be expected to step in. Continuity of care is critical. No wonder the clinician that I spoke to said to me last night that he was deeply uneasy about this. First Minister, are you at all uneasy about this?
First Minister.
Well, let me point out some facts to Richard Leonard, and I'll start by saying we listen to the concerns of clinicians whenever they express those, and we act upon those concerns. But let me address the issue of spend on the use of the private sector in NHS Scotland. In Scotland, it represents right now 0.6% of the frontline health budget. In England, the corresponding figure is 7.3%. The independent private sector is used in Scotland at the very, very margins. It's fully set out transparently in our waiting times improvement plan. It was the case, and I think if memory serves me correctly, although I'm happy to stand corrected if I'm wrong about this, it was used to a greater extent under the last Labour administration. And I heard Jeremy Corbyn and the Shadow Health Secretary of UK Labour say that they would continue to have that kind of approach in NHS England. Now, how do I know about the record of the last Labour administration in Scotland? Because, of course, I was the Health Minister who nationalised Stracathro Hospital, which, of course, had been earmarked for use by the independent sector by a Labour Health Minister in the previous administration. So I'll take no lectures from Labour on these issues, particularly not after last night, because he wants to talk about what was said in the chamber yesterday. Last night in this chamber, Labour voted with the Conservatives against an NHS protection bill that would safeguard our NHS from trade deals with Donald Trump. Shame on Labour for that.
Richard Leonard.
But First Minister, you said that you would use the so-called independent sector in a structured way based on clinical priorities. But how can you do that without the involvement of the clinicians in the hospital where the procedures are being carried out? And this is not the only private company being brought in to regularly carry out clinical procedures at Naval Hospital. There is also Medinet, a business funded by venture capitalists, which is being used to carry out operations at the same hospital. And in the end, yes, you must take responsibility, because in the end, this is a direct result of failures in planning, failures in resource planning, and failures in workforce planning. And First Minister, this is no one else's legacy, is it? This is your legacy. And it's a legacy which has led to private, not public provision. It's a matter of record that NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has been allocated £34 million of Scottish Government funds to bail out the government's failures over waiting times. So, First Minister, today, for the record, can you tell us how much of this £34 million for the NHS is being hived off to private sector providers, their profit margins and their shareholder dividend payments?
First Minister.
I think I said to Richard Leonard in my previous answer that total spend on the use of the private sector in NHS Scotland is 0.6% of the budget. So here's, if that's not good enough for him, here's another piece of information. In the most recent year, 2018-19, procedures undertaken in non-NHS providers represented less than 0.3% of NHS Scotland procedures recorded. So will I take responsibility for the fact that in Scotland, in sharp contrast to England, under the Tories and also under the last Labour UK government, that less than 1% of the spend goes to the private sector and less than 0.5% of the procedures are done in the private sector? Yes, I will take responsibility for that, because I am committed to a publicly owned, publicly delivered health service, and Scotland has that now far more than it did when Labour were in office in Scotland or in the UK. I'm proud of that, and Richard Leonard still has to explain why he voted with the Tories against an NHS protection bill.
We have some constituency supplementary questions. The first from Annie Wells, to be followed by James Kelly. Annie Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, one of my constituents recently raised the case of Sam, a 13-year-old tragically diagnosed with leukaemia. Because of the children's ward's admissions closure at the QEUH in Glasgow, Sam was transferred to Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital. His parents were told they got the last bed, or they would have to have been transferred to hospitals in Aberdeen or even Newcastle. First Minister, can you tell us how many children are in this situation, and are parents now having to cross the border to get urgent cancer care?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I convey my best wishes to Sam and to his family. The reason that the wards are closed at the Queen Elizabeth is, of course, because of the issues that we, Jackson Callow and I, have just been speaking about. And those wards will only reopen when they are safe to do so. In the meantime, of course, children will be given the best care in the hospitals that they go to. Of course, we want that to be as close to their homes as possible, which is why all of the work that I've spoken about today is underway to open these wards again at the Queen Elizabeth as quickly as possible, and we will continue to take that work forward, led, of course, by clinicians and infection control staff and Greater Glasgow Health Board.
James Kelly, to be followed by Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of the tragic death of a homeless man in Glasgow at the weekend who was found dead in a car park in freezing conditions. It comes on the day when Shelter Scotland have taken out a full-page advert in the front of the Herald newspaper highlighting 47 deaths of homeless people in Glasgow over the past year. This is a scandal that shames Scotland and shames Scotland's largest city. The Shelter Scotland are taking out a court action against the City Council because the City Council are ignoring the legal requirements to find accommodation for homeless people. So can I ask the First Minister, as a Glasgow MSP, does she support Shelter Scotland in their action to ensure that the City Council don't ignore homeless people and leave them to sleep homeless on the streets of Glasgow, which is a scandal?
Minister.
Well, firstly, for reasons that I know James Kelly will understand, I'm not going to comment on ongoing legal action, but I will say that I expect all local authorities to meet their legal requirements, Glasgow City Council and any other local authority. The Scottish Government is absolutely determined, working with local authorities, that we will ensure that no person has to sleep rough on the streets. We're investing heavily in improving and expanding homelessness services, including support for rapid rehousing and the Housing First approach. In terms of the the tragic death of the individual that James Kelly has spoken about. Firstly, although this does not at all take away from the tragedy of this, my initial information is that this person was not homeless, but of course there is a police investigation that will require to establish the circumstances fully. Since that incident, my officials have been in touch with stakeholders locally to look at what more we can do. We have offered to Glasgow City Mission, for example, increased funding to try to open the winter night shelter earlier, and those discussions are ongoing. We have also provided funding for more outreach services. So the Scottish Government, working with local authorities, are determined, and I make no bones about this, for Scotland or any other country, as long as one person is homeless or sleeping rough on our streets, then we have more work to do to make sure that we have the services in place that ensure that that is not necessary, and we will continue to do so.
Gordon Lyndhurst to be followed by Monica Lennon.
Does the First Minister agree with the removal of concessionary tram fares for the over 60 and disabled being considered by Edinburgh City Council?
First Minister.
As far as I'm aware, that is a matter for Edinburgh City Council. I'm happy to look into it more in correspondence with the member when I've got more information about it.
Monica Lennon to be followed by Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Because of the ban on new admissions to the children's cancer wards in Glasgow, it is true that there is not enough paediatric intensive care unit provision in Scotland. I know this because of one family who have let me hear about their experience. They have a very ill child who is in a hospital in England and has been there for over 1 month because there is not enough safe inpatient care here in Scotland. First Minister, this is an absolute disgrace. So were you and the Cabinet Secretary aware of this? And what are you doing to increase PICU capacity here in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, the most important thing with any sick child is that they get the best quality clinical care. We want that to be close to home, which is why we are working so hard, the Health Board is working so hard to get to a position where the affected wards can be reopened, wards 2A and 2B, but also 6A, which was the ward that was used when they closed, but is currently closed to readmissions. Work is underway as we speak to get those wards reopened as quickly as possible, but I hope all members would agree and accept that the clinical safety of those wards is absolutely paramount.
And Alexander Burnett.
Can I thank the presiding officer? Now, Aberdeenshire Voluntary Action, a charity in my constituency and the wider North East region, do an incredible amount of work supporting the third sector. Now, First Minister, they say you've frozen their budget for 10 years and now they're facing cuts. So why is this necessary when the Scottish Government budget is increasing?
First Minister.
Well, I wish we weren't in a position where we had to use the members' term freeze budgets. We have sought to protect funding for third sector organisations, and we will continue to do so. But when we have a situation where over the lifetime of this Conservative government, the resources available to this government have been reduced because of Tory austerity, then unfortunately difficult decisions are required. And perhaps the member would like to direct at least some of his comments to his own party colleagues and express his disappointment to them about the austerity they have inflicted on Scotland over these past number of years, and urge them, as I do today, to bring an end to austerity once and for all. I think that might be something that is helpful for a Tory member to do. And I would finally make the point, as I do, and I know the Tories hate hearing this, but of course, if we had followed their advice, if we had opted to give tax cuts to the richest in our society, as the Tories urged us to do, there would be £500 million, probably more than that, less in our budget. So Aberdeenshire Voluntary Action perhaps wouldn't be having a freeze in their budget. It would be much worse because of the Tory policies.
Question number 3, Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I have always been an opponent of fox hunting, and I remain so. This is what the First Minister told us 2 years ago. We've had plenty of talk, but hunting continues in Scotland 17 years after it was meant to have been banned. Unbelievably, the Tories now appear to have a stronger position than the SNP. They've dropped their opposition to the Hunting Act in England, a ban that is slightly less flawed than our own. Now, I've consulted on a bill that would deliver a real ban, and almost 10,000 people have responded. This shows the enormous public interest in this issue. So can the First Minister give me a clear assurance that a real fox hunting ban will be introduced by the end of this parliamentary session?
First Minister.
Well, of course, our proposals to further reform the law were set out by the Minister for Rural Affairs in January this year. When she set out those proposals, they were welcomed in the Chamber by Alison Johnson, who said she welcomed the Minister's intention to improve the Protection of Wild Mammals Scotland Act and looked forward to working with her to deliver what she described then and does today as a real ban. We intend to bring forward legislation. As Alison Johnson has said, she has consulted on a members' bill, so we want to fully analyse the consultation responses to that and reflect that in the legislation that we bring forward. So all of these matters will be fully considered by the Government, and Parliament will be able to fully scrutinise the legislation when we publish it.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. That announcement was 11 months ago. It didn't even warrant a mention in the programme for government, so I am delighted to hear the First Minister's words. But your government has been in power for 12 years now, and what you're doing is at odds with what you're saying. Instead of action, we have endless reviews, we have delays. They've become a hallmark of this government's approach to wildlife protection and more. Over a year and a half ago in this chamber, I raised the issue of the killing, the mass killing of mountain hares on Scotland's grouse moors. The First Minister agreed that it was unacceptable. Over 40,000 hares will have been killed since the First Minister pledged to take action. Now, the blood sports lobby, they'll be jumping for joy at this endless delay, but the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland want to see an end to this indiscriminate slaughter. Is the First Minister too timid to stand up to these vested interests?
First Minister.
No, and can I just complete the point on fox hunting? We have committed to bring forward legislation, and I would have hoped Alison Johnson would have welcomed the fact that we want to take fully into account in that legislation the consultation responses to her private members' bill, and we look forward to continuing to work with members across the chamber who have an interest in these matters. In terms of grouse moor management, of course, we established the Austerity report, and we received that report on Monday. We hope to publish that report before the end of the year and also set out our response to that and how we take forward the recommendations in it. There is absolutely no justification for large-scale culling of mountain hares that threatens their conservation status. Of course, Scotland has already taken action that hasn't yet been taken in the rest of the UK. For example, we are the only country in the UK to already have a close season for brown hares and for mountain hares. So we will continue to take the right steps to protect our wildlife, and we will do that without fear or favour for any vested interest or any other interest.
Thank you. We have some further supplementary questions. The first from Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, can I ask the same question Jo Swinson so disgracefully answered this week? Would you ever be prepared to use nuclear weapons?
First Minister.
No, I wouldn't. I oppose nuclear weapons. I think whenever that question is asked, it should be pointed out that anybody who used nuclear weapons would be doing something that would potentially lead to the death of millions, perhaps tens of millions of people. I think nuclear weapons are immoral. I think they are ineffective. I think they are a waste of money, and I would not countenance their use. And I look forward to the day when not just Scotland is free of nuclear weapons, but the world is free of nuclear weapons.
Ian Gray to be followed by Angela Constance.
Thank you. The First Minister will be well aware of the horrific fire which occurred at student accommodation in Bolton this past weekend. Students across Scotland are now deeply concerned regarding the safety of their accommodation, particularly those in the unregulated, privately owned, purpose-built student accommodation sector. NUS Scotland and students across the country have called on the Scottish Government to lead on a review of the regulation of such accommodation. Can she commit her government to that review, ensuring there can be no room for complacency when it comes to the safety of our students?
First Minister.
Yes, I think I can. Certainly, there is absolutely no complacency and no room for complacency. We set up, of course, a task force in the light of the dreadful tragedy at Grenfell and have been working on many of these issues about cladding, about regulations since then. But, of course, the dreadful incident that happened last week is a further reminder that we cannot be complacent. So if there is a feeling that there is a further review needed of regulations, then I'm happy to give the undertaking that the Government is very open to doing that.
Angela Constance to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, claimed that government is not responsible for poverty. So, can the First Minister agree that every government, including hers, has a responsibility and a duty to end poverty? And can she outline our responsibilities and the actions that the Scottish Government is taking to address poverty here in Scotland?
First Minister.
Yes, I think every government, including the Scottish Government, has a responsibility to tackle poverty. The Scottish Government takes that responsibility very seriously. We are, for example, spending more than £100 million a year to mitigate the worst impacts of Tory welfare cuts. We are taking a range of actions to get money into the pockets of the lowest paid and the poorest in our society. Most recently, we've announced plans for the Scottish Child Payment. We set up the new social security system, which is putting more money into the pockets of carers and low-income families and has dignity at its heart. And of course, Angela Constance is to be credited with a great deal of work that led to that. And finally, I would say this, in terms of the current UK government, it's not just that they have a responsibility to help tackle poverty, they have a responsibility to acknowledge that they are responsible for an increase in poverty in this country because of their austerity and their welfare cuts. And I think that is something everybody should reflect very seriously on. And I think most people would be wondering what on earth Priti Patel was talking about when she made that ridiculous and completely outrageous comment.
Neil Findlay, to be followed by Christine Graham. Neil Findlay.
NHS Lothian is predicting a £90 million budget deficit, yet it is paying up to £1,700 a shift to a private nursing agency to cover staff absence. Why?
First Minister.
Well, we encourage health boards to use nursing banks where they need temporary staff cover, and there indeed is the case that NHS boards will do that. Obviously, where there are short-term issues of staff absences or recruitment, then the priority is to make sure that wards are properly staffed. But we have a long-standing determination to make sure that we minimise the amount of money that is spent on agencies as opposed to banking nursing, and we will continue to prioritise with health boards that action.
And Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As this is Scottish Book Trust Week, does the First Minister agree with me that Scots is a living language? For example, my favourite is búrach, as in Brexit búrach. And in that vein, what is her favourite Scots word?
First Minister.
I was going to say, I can't. I have to come back to Christine Graham on that. I'm scared I'll use one that might be a bit rude or something accidentally in the chamber. I like búrach as well because it sums up a lot of what the current UK government has been presiding over the last wee while. But can I take the opportunity to agree with Christine Graham about the importance and the living nature of the Scots language, but also take the opportunity to promote Scottish Book Week as a book lover, a lover of reading. I think we should all take the opportunity to encourage particularly our young people to read more in whatever language they choose to read in, and that's why I'm so proud of the First Minister's Reading Challenge, which chooses to do that and tries to do that in schools across the country.
Thank you. Question number 4, Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government is recognising this year's Carers' Rights Day.
First Minister.
Carers' Rights Day is an opportunity for us to recognise the importance of carers across the country and the huge contribution that they make day in and day out to our communities and our society. It's also an opportunity to help carers understand their rights and access the support to which they're entitled. Today, the Public Health Minister marked Carers' Rights Day at the launch of the Triangle of Care Toolkit in Glasgow. This provides a helpful framework for mental health professionals to involve carers in decisions about the care and treatment of their loved one. The Social Security Secretary has also announced today that the next payment of the Carers Allowance Supplement will be paid before Christmas to Scotland's carers. And of course, this payment means that carers in Scotland get £452 more a year than those out with Scotland.
Tom Arthur.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? Each day, thousands across Scotland and the wider UK become carers, something few would have been able to plan for. It's no wonder caring can feel overwhelming and stressful, with a need to talk to health and social care providers, to negotiate with their employers, or deal with the intricacies of the benefits system. Can the First Minister set out how her government is supporting Scotland's nearly 800,000 carers, including 44,000 who are under the age of 18, to feel empowered and ensure that they are treated with the dignity, fairness and respect they deserve?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Tom Arthur for raising this issue and firstly take the opportunity to say a personal thank you to everybody who undertakes caring responsibilities across our country. We can never, ever repay them in full, but we have an obligation to make sure that we provide them with the help and support they need. Alongside the actions I've already mentioned, we're focusing on embedding carers' rights under the Carers Act and developing a national marketing campaign to raise awareness of rights. We continue to fund and promote the Carer Positive Employer Accreditation Scheme. There's over 400,000 people across Scotland now working for organisations committed to helping their staff who are juggling work and caring responsibilities. We're also consulting on our Carer Strategic Policy Statement, which maps out how these and other policies contribute to improving the way carers are listened to and supported. And finally, I'm proud that Scotland is so far the first place in the UK where young carers are able to get financial support through our Young Carer Grant, which is a £300 annual payment for carers aged 16 to 18, which of course opened last month.
Question number 5, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government is supporting shipbuilding in Fife and across Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, Scotland has a rich shipbuilding heritage and it's an industry that continues to demonstrate its expertise. That expertise was recognised last week with the award of the contract for the first 5 Type 31 frigates to Babcock, and I'm delighted that that announcement will bring security to the skilled workforce at Rosyth. We look forward to working with them to maximise the benefits for Scotland, for Rosyth and for our supply chain. We continue also to support shipbuilding more generally across Scotland and will continue to do so.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank the First Minister for her response. She referenced the award to Babcock's in Rosyth of the £1.25 billion contract to build 5 new frigates for the Royal Navy, securing hundreds of jobs in Fife for many years to come, and indeed elsewhere in Scotland, and bringing the total number of British Navy vessels being built in Scotland to 18, including 13 frigates, in addition to the 2 recently completed aircraft carriers. So all the Chamber should welcome that news. But can the First Minister tell us how many frigates would there be in the Navy of an independent Scotland?
First Minister.
You see, the flaw in Murdo Fraser's supposedly really clever attack here is that you only have to look at many small independent countries across the world to find that they actually have shipbuilding industries that are even more flourishing than anything in the UK. Scotland, as an independent country, will support our shipbuilding industry. We will do that because of the expertise. Nobody is doing our shipbuilding industry any favours. They win contracts because they are the best at what they do, and that will continue to be the case, whatever Scotland's constitutional future.
Mark Roskill.
The 15-year delay decommissioning the nuclear submarines at Rosyth Dockyard has cost the taxpayer billions of pounds. So what more can the Scottish Government do to free up the yard for low-carbon shipbuilding while removing these weapons from Joe Swinson's reach?
First Minister.
Well, obviously the first issue there that Matt Ruskell raised is unfortunately not a matter for the Scottish Government. That is a matter for the UK Government and the MOD, although we do want to see Rosyth flourish, and as well as what I've just been talking to Murdo Fraser about, I do think there is a great potential in terms of low-carbon work in the future. In terms of nuclear weapons, I think I've made my view of that clear. I want to see Faslane, for example, be a conventional naval base. I don't want to see it continue to be the host to weapons of mass destruction, because I think all of us should be determined to see a nuclear-free Scotland playing its full contribution in a nuclear-free world.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the First Minister agree with me that it's a bit rich for the Tories to come to this chamber and claim credit for the shipbuilding industry after the devastation they've wrought on many shipbuilding communities across Scotland, including my own in Greenock and Inverclyde? Of the Finance Secretary Derek Mackay for his actions in saving Ferguson Marine and Port Glasgow, saving jobs and providing a future for the yard.
First Minister.
I couldn't agree more with Stuart McMillan. But seriously, yes, there are, of course, remaining challenges at Ferguson's, but Ferguson's would no longer be open right now but for the action this government has taken. And, you know, I used to, before the boundaries changed, I used to represent Govan Shipyard in this Parliament. That honour now lies with Hamza Yousaf. So I've seen over the years the broken Westminster promises to our shipbuilding industry time and time and time again. Westminster governments, I have to say not just Tory Westminster governments, but of all colours, have not treated our shipbuilding industry the way they should have done. I look forward to a thriving shipbuilding industry in Scotland because those who work in our shipyards are the best at what they do and they deserve to flourish.
And question number 6, Rhoda Grant.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking in response to reports that 1 in 20 households that use food banks has an unstable income due to self-employment or being on a zero-hour contract.
First Minister.
No one should go hungry or have to rely on food banks in Scotland. The Scottish Government is taking action to tackle insecure work as part of our Fair Work agenda. Through Fair Work First, we're extending Fair Work criteria to as many funding streams as we can by the end of this Parliament. These criteria include no inappropriate use of zero-hours contracts and payment of the real living wage. Of course, legislation related to zero-hours contracts is reserved to the UK Parliament, and we've made it very clear our opposition to the inappropriate use of these and other types of employment that offer workers no job security. In the 3 years to June 2019, the proportion of people in employment on a zero-hour contract in Scotland fell from 3% to 2.6%, but we want to see further progress in the months and years to come.
Rhoda Grant.
We've seen a 10% rise in the number of people employed on zero-hour contracts, and that percentage is now 70,000 people. And it's simply not enough to promote fair work. The government must act on it. Public procurement is one of the opportunities they have to end insecure work in Scotland. And will the First Minister act now? Will she outlaw zero-hour contracts when she's procuring services from the public sector? When she is procuring... If the First Minister is really serious about tackling poverty, this is something she can do right now.
First Minister.
Well, firstly, let me point out, as I did in my original answer, that the proportion of people in employment on a zero-hour contract has fallen. I want to see it fall further. The Fair Work First approach is important, and we will take forward that in relation to procurement, in relation to government funding streams, more generally. But Rhoda Grant says that's not enough, and actually, on a point of consensus, I agree with her. I would much prefer to be in a position where we can legislate to use what she said, to ban inappropriate use of zero-hours contracts. There's just one slight problem in that. Legislation on employment matters is reserved to Westminster. And time again, Labour have opposed the devolution of employment law to this Parliament. So if Rhoda Grant is signalling a change of heart on that, I am delighted. And I've made this kind of offer to Richard Leonard before in this chamber. I'll sign a letter to the UK Government with you this afternoon demanding the immediate devolution of employment law, and then we can get on with doing exactly what Rhoda Grant is asking us to do. So the offer is open.
Thank you. Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move shortly. First Minister's questions is over. That concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Annie Wells on World Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease Day, but we're going to have a short suspension to allow members of the gallery and ministers to change seats. A short suspension.